That's always the code word for Ashley to start the recording. So now we're being recorded. Hi, I'm Wes Hines. I'm the Nuclear Engineering Department Head at the University of Tennessee, and welcome to our weekly graduate student colloquium program. I just got finished being on a call with our chancellor, and it was very uplifting. She's talking about what's going to happen in the fall semester, and her prediction and the plan right now is that we return to full capacity, that we won't be requiring masks, that we can sit right next to each other, and it'll be kind of like it was a year and a half ago. So that's exciting for us. Something else that's exciting for us is that today we have Sarah Pruett as our speaker. She works for the University of Tennessee Office of Research and Engagement as our Assistant Vice Chancellor for Responsible Conduct of Research, and she's also our Institutional Research Integrity Office. She started this position in 2019, where she provides oversight of research conflict of interest, as well as the export control program, which we're going to learn more about today. She also coordinates the institutional institutional official for Human Resource Protection Program and the Institutional Review Board, as well as serves as the Research Integrity Officer and the designated official for Institutional Biosafety Committee. She's a signatory official for radioactive material licenses and permits for the radiation safety, promotes a culture of responsible and ethical research on campus through responsible conduct of research training and outreach programs. She also invited Jane Burns to join us. Jane is a University of Tennessee alum and has been named the Research Integrity Compliance Director for the Office of Research Engagement, effective March 1, 2021. So maybe 5 weeks into the job. So welcome, Jane. Glad you can join us too. So Sarah, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. I appreciate the vote of support and the invitation to come and for letting me add Jane. In addition to Jane's new title as Director of Research Integrity, she has been the long-standing Export Control Officer for UTIA. And we were fortunate enough, as the programs merged with our unification efforts, to be able to sneak Jane into my program. And since Darren has left, she has filled those shoes as well. And I'm thrilled to have her with us today. Let's see. I will go ahead and share screen and get the slides going. I am excited to be here today. This is fun for me. I love to get out and talk to students and researchers. I used to be a faculty member elsewhere and had my own research program. So this is fun. This is fun times for me. The other reason I'm excited to be here today is that nuclear engineers have a group of probably higher risks with export control than most of the other groups on campus. There are extra laws written just for your field. I want to make sure that everybody understands that they can put, at a minimum, they understand that it's important to pay attention to this, and that they know who to contact, whether it's me or Jane. Any one of us can get you help. And just to take it seriously. I know when I went through school, export control was literally never mentioned, and I'm a chemist by training, so you'd think somewhere along the way it would have been, but it wasn't. So we can do better, and we shall do better starting right now. I appreciate everybody joining for a discussion of export control. Feel free to jump in anytime, ask anything you want to ask. Either Jane or I can answer it, or we'll write it down and get you the answer later. All right, and without further ado, here we go. I'm going to minimize all of the faces so I can see my tiny screen. So what we're going to cover today, it's a lot to cover export control in 45 minutes, but we're going to do our best to talk a little bit about the definitions and expectations, and especially the consequences, because it's easy to think about administrative oversight and rules and like, okay, whatever. But there are real, actual, serious consequences for export control violations. And I want you to walk away from this presentation with an understanding of that and kind of the underpinnings of why it's very, very important. What types of controls we use to manage these regulatory requirements, some of the considerations that are unique to research. Some of you will probably go into careers in academia, some of you may not. You'll go into private industry or maybe go work for the national lab. There are research considerations. There are also broader considerations in the regulations for your particular area. What's fundamental, what's not fundamental research, we'll unpack a good bit later on in this talk, and how it helps universities do research a little more easily. What happens if you do land in an export control scenario? You'll need something called a technology control plan. Jane's going to talk to you about how to get other areas where export control can help, because it's not all about just developing a TCP and moving on. And then we'll have a brief summary, time for questions, but again, you don't have to wait for the end for questions, jump right in. So what is export control? Basically, it's a set of regulations from the US government, whether it's from Commerce or State or Treasury or a variety of other regulatory bodies within the US government that regulate this distribution of strategically important products. That can be services, that can be technology, that can be information outside of the country. And outside of the country doesn't necessarily mean that you left the US, that you put it in a FedEx box and something went outside the United States borders. You can export something to, say, a foreign national without ever leaving your office in all likelihood, particularly in a university environment. The other piece of this is that along with those regulations, there's always the do it this way or there's a consequence. And the consequences for export control violations can be pretty severe. There are civil penalties, there are criminal penalties, depending on what exactly the nature of the violation was, how long did it go on, scope, and it can include not just hefty fines for the university, it can include fines for the individual, and it can include prison time. And we actually had, unfortunately, a researcher go to jail for export control violations several years ago. All right. So a little more about expectations and consequences. My expectations that I want to convey to you as a group of students is to follow the guidance of the export control officer. This is a group of individuals, or an individual right now with Jane, we're growing our office, but they're very careful and very particular, and they will dive deep into all of the minutia that you'll see later about how to protect yourself, to protect the university, and to maintain the integrity of both your research materials and the outcomes. Ask, don't assume. It really and truly, if you only take one thing away, that's it. Ask early, ask often. There are no silly questions here. Please don't assume, because again, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, the various sanctions are significant. And I would encourage you to keep thorough records. That's true whether it's an export control project or not. That's just good, responsible conduct of research. And we could certainly unpack data management on a different day, but especially in the case of export control, you want to make sure you have good inventory. You want to know what you have. You want to know if you've used part of it, who used it, when did they use it, why did they use it. Inventory control matters, facilities matter, and just keeping good records. It's just good practice as a scientist, and I know you guys can all do great at this. Safeguard your information and materials. We'll get into that a little bit more. That's outlined specifically in some of the technology control plan options. And if you have a question about a violation or an attempted violation, to contact our offices or me directly immediately. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200 Monopoly style. Contact me immediately so that we can alert the proper authorities, so that we can help you minimize the damage. If we need to contact police, or if we need to contact the FBI or whoever it might need to be to make sure that you are protected to the best level possible, that helps us. It also helps us to avoid any ongoing consequence or ongoing behaviors that can be fixed. We had, I had a call, I guess it was last week. There was a gentleman in another department who had almost been the victim. His graduate students were more savvy than the person that was trying to spearfish their export controlled technology. But it was an attempt. So that securing the human training that comes from OIT, it actually matters. Confirm outside of your email thread, for example. Don't just send back whatever's been requested if you have a question. It was a pretty good impersonation that the spearfishing attempt had of the faculty member. And we're working with OIT to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. What can we do to protect our people better? But if I don't know about a problem, I can't help you manage a problem. So please ask, don't assume, reach out early and often, because if the expectations can't be met over here, the consequences again are bad. There's the criminal sanctions for, this is Department of Commerce with the EAR, and willful violations. That's where you know it's wrong, you did it on purpose, you meant to do it. Willful gets you some very hefty penalties. So $1 million, 5 times the value of the export. That's for the university. The individual can have some very significant penalties as well. You know, I don't have $250,000, you know, at the ready to pay a fine just because I didn't want to ask the question. And I certainly don't have 10 years laying around to go to prison for it. So I encourage everyone to take this very seriously. Knowing violations, kind of a lower tier, there's no such thing as really a low tier for an export control violation, but you thought maybe this wasn't the right thing to do, but you did it anyway. You didn't check, you did the assume, didn't ask, instead of ask, don't assume. So that's what that means within the regulations. We've got some words on this page that I don't think we've defined yet. There's export administration regulations. So you're going to see that throughout as EAR. There's also ITAR. This relates more to military applications, things like missile defense, maybe GPS tracking systems that they could use in military applications, things of that nature. And it's controlled by the rules are controlled by a different set of regulatory bodies. But again, they have very significant penalties as well. What we're trying to do with export control is to protect the interests of the United States and the interests of national security in particular here. Export control officer duty. And I am going to turn it over to Jane because she's our export control officer and I want you all to get to meet her.
Hello, and thank you very much. I'm very, very excited to be here today and to be in the Office of Research and Engagement and to be here. It's been kind of a transitional month for me coming over from the Institute of Agriculture. So this is my first week to be here full time. And I'm very excited to be here to be able to spend full attention to these issues. So as far as what an export control officer does, one of the things is the proposal and award reviews. So when money is coming in from a sponsor to support the work of the researcher, you know, we've got proposals that are going out to the sponsor, we've got awards that are coming in various forms. You know, we can have contracts, we can have grants, we can have, you know, other sorts of agreements and where they give the funding to the universities to support the work. And the export control officer is brought into this review at both, you know, kind of at both stages. So this is working in sponsored programs. I'm pretty familiar with those reviews as they've gone on. I had kind of a dual role working in sponsored programs and also as compliance officer and export control officer for UTIA. So had quite a bit of time spent looking at, you know, what the requirements would be, looking at the wording of contracts, and the export control officer helps vet all of that and gets pulled into those reviews to make sure that then if there is any export controlled technology and anything needs to be put in place, that's put in place. So working closely with the faculty members, vetting the collaborations. This goes hand in hand with this, but whenever you're working with anyone internationally, then this is a time we've got some restricted party screening. So we look and we see, is this person or this organization on a list that makes them someone of concern? Maybe you're working, your work is sponsored by an organization, or you're looking to have a subaward go to a particular organization. Then that's when we're going to be vetting the collaborations. Also, if you have a visitor coming onto campus, then that is another time that we're looking at, who is this visitor? What kind of information you're going to be sharing with that person? And again, are they on any sort of a list that might make them of concern? So we have software to help do this restricted party screening. And that's one of the things that we can screen for is just individuals and organizations. And it has dozens of different databases out there that it looks to see, is there any reason to be concerned about the individual? So audits of ongoing projects. So if you've got an export control project, then we will be looking at, are things going according to plan, according to the technology control plan? And we'll be looking at, coming and looking at the lab and making sure that we're answering any questions that you have related to your specific project. Assistance, as mentioned, with the non-compliance events. So if there's anything that looks wrong, anything that looks like maybe this is a little, maybe this shouldn't be happening, somebody's getting access that shouldn't, or what have you, then we're there to help with that. Obtaining and maintaining licenses. So these licenses are export control licenses that are required to either export an item, for instance, or technology. And this can include maybe someone is working on campus and we still may need a license if the foreign person is working with export control technology. And it's a little bit more complicated. It depends on the situation. And we try to avoid situations where we need licenses, to be honest. We try to do as much, under an exclusion, to do open research and publish and such, but sometimes we will need a license. So whenever we do need to get a license, then the export control officer will help with that. And something we need more often is the technology control plan. So if you have export control technology, something that does need to be controlled, then this plan helps lay out all of those guidelines. What kind of physical controls, what kind of IT controls, and anyone who is going to have control or have access to that export control technology should be on that technology control plan. So we will help develop those, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Training and awareness. So we can do one-on-one sessions, individual guidance. We can do awareness training like this. We can do all sorts of different things depending on what your needs are. And so keep us in mind for that. Also, for people who are working with export control technology, there's some city training on our online platform. And we've got, you can come to us about that, come to the export control officer about that, and we can make sure that you know where that training is and get your certification, your certificate for that training. It's actually not a very long session, but it's a very important session. So it's definitely anyone interested, and certainly anybody who's on a technology control plan or working with export control technology should take this. And then information security. If you need access, secure enclave access, if you need to have the IT security officer come and look, then we're there to help make sure that is in place. And then finally, on this list, we've got the travel reviews. I feel like I say on this list, I think there are a few other things, but these are the bulk of the things that we're looking at. The travel reviews, if the export control officer is automatically going to be pulled in if it's travel to a certain country. So we will be pulled in, we'll probably be contacting you, asking you a few questions. But even if you're not going to one of those countries of concern, something that pulls us in to the travel, we're also available to help advise. You may be going to a conference or we'll again talk a bit more about that, but you may be going somewhere on a trip and you're thinking, are there maybe some things I should be better securing? Certainly you don't want to be just taking export control technology, even if you're not going to a country of concern, if you're traveling around. And so we can talk with you about those issues, whether or not we're in the formal process. We're always there to answer these questions and help out. Go to the next slide. So Cayuse is our system, our sponsored program system. So I mentioned the reviews of the proposals and the awards. Those things are going to be in this Cayuse system, and the Office of Sponsored Programs will be helping with this system when you have the proposals and awards. And you can see one of the pages within that system is specifically about export control. So all of these questions are designed to flag things that may be of concern. It doesn't necessarily mean you've got export control technology or that you need a license if you've checked some of these things, but it may very well mean that. So you can see some of the things on here about homeland security concerns. You can see spacecraft technology, traveling outside the US. And you'll notice on this page, it talks about, foreign nationals, what is a foreign national / person? And so are you working with those people? Are you going to be transmitting funds to certain countries? And they've got the link there to get to those countries so you can see which countries are involved. Or do you anticipate any work down at the bottom with some of the classified materials or things that are on? You can see the USML, and we had mentioned the ITAR. So again, these are Department of State, these are military sort of items. And then the EAR, so are you going to be working with anything on those lists? And you may not know. I mean, that's the thing. Sometimes when you're going through and you're trying to submit a proposal, you're not thinking about this, or you may not know if it might be. So you can look at that list or certainly reach out and ask. We can help you determine if those things should be marked, because we want to make sure. I would say it's better to mark it than not. And then you can always add a note that says, I'm not so sure about this, this item or this technology, but I marked this. You can always add a note, and that can be helpful, or send an email, but definitely reach out. Don't hesitate to do that. So I know how the proposals go, and I know they're often in a hurry, but it's important to flag things so that we can look at it. The next slide. So types of export controls. Again, we mentioned EAR, that's the Department of Commerce. So these things are dual use. They may have a military use and a non-military use. We're typically using them for non-military uses, but they may think that they could have a military use. And really, a lot of what we deal with falls under EAR. They're very specific classifications, such as these codes you see over here, the 1C007. That is an example of an ECCN under EAR. There's also EAR 99, which can be a wide scope of, a lot of items. They're kind of things you think of being not things that you expect to be classified, but those typically don't require licenses, but they still fall under EAR. And then some of these other things require a lot more thought, and these things, other items with more specific classifications, because it can vary considerably in terms of how restricted it is. And then there is ITAR. again, that's the Department of State, and these are weapons, military, those things are typically going to require licenses, more often going to require licenses. Also, it's a little bit more black and white, I think. I think with the EAR, you have to do a lot more, it's a lot more tiered approach with the EAR. But with the ITAR, usually those things are going to be restricted to in especially to certain countries. And then you've got the UCNI, the unclassified nuclear information. So that, again, we mentioned that you've got an extra controls for your things. So this is, she'll talk a little bit more about that. And also the travel. I brought the travel up. Conferences, this is something that the FBI is always very concerned about. They're really trying to protect, all U.S. interest, and conferences are a place that they are really concerned when you're doing any sort of traveling. But conferences are a place where people are targeted really to try to get that information from you. We're going to make you feel comfortable and make you feel, valued and your opinion valued. And sometimes people let their guards down a little bit. So I know there's always a lot of concern that there may be some information shared that shouldn't be shared. So really do keep your guard up, when you're traveling, and even if it is a conference, and think about not taking certain export control technology, or not taking export control technology, and really restricting what you have with you when you travel. These examples over here of these codes, again, these are the ECCN codes, and these are provided just to show you some of the detail that goes into these. The codes, a few years ago, they did make some changes to the codes to make them very clear that if you know the product, then you know which code it falls in. It's not, it's not a matter of, well, it might be in this one or might be in this one. They tried to make them very specific so that it definitely is in this code, one code or another. And that's very helpful because and you can see how very specific it is in here with some of these descriptions. But if you had, for instance, for something that fell under the 1C007, then within our software, the export control software, we can get in that export control software and check to see if that is the code. First off, we can get the full descriptions in the code, so we can get with you and look at it and make sure that we're properly classifying it. But then once we do properly classify it, we can then do a determination about, so which countries would require licenses. Does it require a license to send something to a certain country, or to send, to have someone with, if the technology falls under this and you've got somebody in your office, then, and they're not a US person, then does it require a license for them to access that technology? And it will depend on these codes. And again, that software that we have, this is where we really have to work together. The export control officer and the researchers really have to work together, because we are not necessarily going to know all of the details that you're going to know about your products or about your technology. But if we sit down and work together, then we can make sure it's properly classified and then determine if a license is needed or not. So I guess we can go to the next slide.
Okay, and I think this is where I was going to pick it back up. So I mentioned when we started that there are laws that are written specifically about nuclear materials and nuclear technology, and this is just one of the sets of laws that go with that. And I just want to highlight how very important it is to make sure that as nuclear engineers that you are thinking about this all the time. And I am certain that I'm not the only person that drills this into your head, so I will take a light touch. But be aware that the materials and items that you work with can have very, very specific controls on them. And it can be something as simple as the components. And this sounds like, okay, it should be maybe a big piece. But when we talk about export control, and I want to give Wes some kudos here because he encouraged me to go to a seminar in DC that was hosted by a law group, and it had people from TVA and some of the other large energy companies there, and then me from the University of Tennessee. But I learned some things, and one of the things that they talked about was people imparting kind of the know-how with this. Please, I don't have the manual. Can you just come teach me how to do it? That would be an export. The screws that might hold something together would be another example. It's not a big deal. It's just a screw. It's not just a screw, because that screw can be specifically designed to withstand the conditions in that reactor. And then when you have shared that with an external party, potentially, this was the example that they used, and it resonated with me, so I'll use it again. They can reverse engineer that to take that technology. And as much as I like to be about fundamental research, this is the kind of thing that can lead to not just loss of intellectual property or loss of revenue, but it can also lead to, hey, we did this wrong. And so now instead of getting things through proper channels, we've created an environment where there can be an event that is catastrophic. So it makes a lot of sense to be very, very careful. It's something as simple as a tiny bolt can matter in this environment. So I just want you all to think about that as you move through your professional development and careers, that you really, in this field in particular, need to be careful with how you handle and transmit data, whether it's through conversation, whether it's through trainings, etc. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. Let's see. Maybe if my screen lets me advance. Okay, so now we're going to get to the part that is most applicable to universities. This is the part where we try to get the sponsor programs to. The contracts may come in with we can get things back down to fundamental research. And fundamental research is really where most university research is. I'm a big fan of open research, sharing information. There are areas where it's appropriate. There are areas where it's not appropriate. The vast majority of research that goes on at the University of Tennessee and most other universities does fall within the fundamental research exclusion. Export controls are not applied to technology or software for the universities. It's grounded again in that idea of open research. Everybody's welcome, all the students are welcome, all the postdocs are welcome. Let's talk about this at conferences. Let's share knowledge and grow the breadth and depth of our fields. There are exceptions to this, and this is something, and it's an important point that gets lost. We think fundamental research, everything's in, everything's fine, it's fundamental, I can do literally whatever I want. Are going to have a mixture of fundamental research areas and potentially export controlled areas. And I want to make this very clear. Physical items are always, always, always subject to export controls. There's no free pass on shipping things, physical items out of the country or giving them to a foreign national, for example. There is no exception for this. Fundamental research encompasses a lot of what we do, but it does not cover that. And again, we can have a mixture of fundamental and export control, and sometimes even within the same project, it can be a little muddier maybe than folks think. A lot of the times we catch export control because it's flowed down in a contract, but that's not the only way that it comes into play. I want to make the point here. I know that there are individuals within this department in particular that work closely with industry. There are fundamental research exclusions through commerce with industry, but not for ITAR. So if you get into that USML classification, kind of the more military type items, for them, it's outside of the area where it can be fundamental research excluded. And you'll see that in the contracts as they come in, where they have to control in a different way, and they're sponsoring your research, so they expect those controls to flow down. And the other important piece here is that published patents are exempted as well. So if it's published, if it's out in the open space, you're on better footing. So again, fundamental research, things you have to think about. Is it controlled? If it's fundamental, no export control restrictions except for physical items. If it's not within that, we have to look at what Jane was showing you earlier, like with the nuclear graphite, the ECCNs and the USML numbers, so that we know exactly how to control it and what the minutia are essentially with those particular topics and items, okay? And it'll either fall under a specific USML, ECCN, or it'll be EAR 99. And we've talked about EAR 99 a bunch, but what exactly is it? Because it could be alphabet soup in here, frankly. I mean, brought to you by a soup company with all of the lingo that goes with export control. It is basically if you have a physical item, if it's fundamental research, or if you have something, it's fundamental research, stop there. If it's not within fundamental research, it's either going to be ECCN, USML, or EAR 99. And EAR 99 captures pretty much everything else that doesn't have that very specific classification that Jane was describing. We're talking about things that you would never think would need to be on a commerce control list. Things like ballpoint pens, which is why I've got my clip art in there, telephone wire, just a whole host of common everyday things that could be considered potentially useful. And so they're controlled. And what those controls do is you have sort of a presumption that it's going to be okay, but you have to check, where is it going? What is it being used for? Sometimes there will be a license required, sometimes there won't be. And it's not as clear cut as saying, okay, it's EAR 99, it's totally fine. There are examples of people shipping telephone wire, which you could ship to France or wherever, probably be just fine. But they shipped it to somewhere in Pakistan, and that group that it went to was on a list that was denied. And so then came the export control violations to go with that shipment. So just be very careful with this. Most everything is going to have some level of control to it, even your ballpoint pens. That's not to scare anyone, and most of the time it's completely fine. It's just you need to be aware that there are all these rules, and to just ask. Just don't assume, just ask. For research, Jane, is this where you're taking back over? I believe it is.
Yes, I think it is.
Because she digs into this.
Yes, so we mentioned the awards that come in and the contracts that come in. The publication restrictions, they are really a huge issue, as far as looking at export control, because we want that fundamental research exclusion, right? And so we do not want restrictions on publication. So there can be wording within a contract that completely, that does compromise that. So we don't want to have wording in a contract that turns something into export control that we really didn't intend to be. There was really no need for it to be. So we need to have that fundamental research exclusion if it's if it need, unless we particularly need for it to be export controlled. But we want, if it's not export controlled, or if it's not subject to export control, then the regulations, then we want to be sure that it wasn't a mistake because of some wording in a contract. So anyway, there is what they call a pre-publication review, and the sponsor can say, hey, I would like to look at this, when we want to have a right to look at this, what you're about to publish, but we're looking at it for these specific reasons in here. They don't want their patent rights compromised or any proprietary information that they have furnished to be revealed if it shouldn't be revealed. But that is all that they're really looking at. that's all that they're pointing out to say, hey, do not include this. They are not saying do not publish the results. So that is okay. You still have your fundamental research exclusion, and there are some caveats around this. You have to be careful about how long. They'll usually say how long they need to see, that they want their pre-publication review to be. So if they're wanting to see it for a couple of months before you publish, then that's fine. But if they're saying they want to see it for a year before they publish, then that's really gets into a questionable area. So those are the kinds of things that you're, again, talk to your export control officer. You see something in there and you think, oh, wait, this is restricting this. And then have those conversations. We've been in conversations with general counsel about those things sometimes to say, okay, this is kind of at the border of where is this a standard practice for them to have it for this long? And they'll, we've had some conversations about whether it is or isn't, and there may be some extenuating circumstances in certain either industries or maybe with some international parties or what have you, but those take some conversations to see, is this okay or not? And then we mentioned these clauses, the DFARS, the Department of Defense, if we see the 710, if we see the 712, if we see any requirements for the CMMC on these military projects, then there are going to be extra controls related to those. So we need to definitely be kind of flagging those. We see those in contracts, then make sure that we're aware of that the export control officer is aware of that. There are some times that things can actually be taken out of contracts. Maybe not these, maybe, but there are some times that we can actually work with the sponsor and take a clause out that is adding some additional controls. But these are some things to be aware of, and to, again, make sure that the export control officer is involved in those conversations so that we can either help adjust the contract if we can, and if it does require the controls, that we then move forward with the technology control plan or the other means to see that the controls are in place. So next slide. I think I have a few seconds delay to actually see the slides as they move forward. So
It's not a delay, it's just not progressing.
it's not mine.
Awesome. Here we go.
Okay, great. Maybe it's a little of both. So, okay. So personnel restrictions. So there are some times that the sponsor will limit to a U.S. citizen. And those are definitely some restrictions that we need to talk to the export control officer about. Every once in a while that will come up. And again, maybe it's something that can be negotiated out, because maybe they didn't really intend for that to be. There are times that I've heard it told to someone, but it's not in the contract. So conversations that we definitely need to flesh out and figure out, is it truly limited to a U.S. citizen, because that will certainly require a plan to make sure that's the case. The other U.S. persons is a different term. And back to on that Cayuse page where it talked about foreign persons and that is a different description, and you can look either on that Cayuse page or here. It includes the U.S. citizen or also a green card holder. So if something is export controlled, then usually it's not going to be restricted to U.S. citizens. It will be restricted to U.S. persons. So that is just something to keep in mind, that there's a difference there. And in the idea of deemed exports, so this is about not items, but this is about the technology and the code. And this is the idea that if someone is in the United States, so you could have someone in your lab who is not a U.S. person. So you can have a foreign person in your lab, and that is a deemed export. So we think about exports as being something that you physically ship out, but this is not necessarily the case. And really with universities, it's quite often the case. We deal much more with deemed exports than we do with actually shipping the items out, although we deal with both. Next slide. And so the considerations, you need to look at not only your physical security that we've talked about and the physical protection of things, but also the information concerns, the information security. So we kind of have to look at all of this together. Just means to reasonably ensure that your materials will be used only for the authorized purposes, that there will not be any theft, that there will not be any sabotage. So this can include, locking things up and, just physically where are things, the inventory that Sarah mentioned. So definitely want to physically keep things secure. And then there's just a lot of information control needed. And that's something that requires a lot of thought. These NIST standards, these clauses, different levels of protection. And so there's a lot to consider there. And I think we can move to the next slide. And I think Sarah, you maybe are covering it a little bit more.
Right. So the DFARS clause that Jane talks about calls out, and the government is so much fun when they write these clauses that they'll have a big long regulatory thing, and then it will call out something else, and it will call out something else. Well, they ultimately call out NIST standards, and NIST has a variety of different standards that they employ for information control. And the one in the DFARS clause is 800-171. And what that does is it has a series of 100 plus controls where it's grouped into groups of control types. So there's access, there's integrity, there's configuration management, storage, physical protection. So it's not just how is your computer set up, it's what are the controls on your space? What happens if someone leaves the project? How fast are you going to be able to shut off the access they have to the data that's controlled? All sorts of things. But what does that mean for you at UT? And it's really dependent on what level of control you need, what data restrictions are called out in your contract. There's a host of options that I will highlight. There are virtual machines that you can use through OIT, so you never are storing data on your own laptops or desktops, maybe in your lab. There's a secure enclave for heightened access as well, depending on what configurations you need, where we can whitelist applications and all sorts of things that are called out in the NIST. There's different encryption strategies that can be used. For some things, they're just not going to be able to go into or feed into an enclave environment easily. So maybe we need to air gap those items. And there's other cloud storage options. The thing I want to highlight, and it's a person, not a thing, is Ashley Pearson is amazing. And she works directly for your department, and she is just absolutely fantastic at this. We work with her regularly on getting information controls in place and figuring out what's needed, what's appropriate for the particular PI and students. So if you have a question, obviously, of course, our offices need to be involved in this. It's part of the requirements for that, which is great. So I want to make sure you know that Ashley is a resource, and you absolutely ask her questions. And I'm probably putting Ashley a little bit on the spot here, but I think the world of her, and she's tremendous. So then I'm going to turn this back over to Jane, and I could tell you how to get a TCP, but she's the one who's going to help you directly for now until we get a larger office in building one of these if you end up in a space where you actually need one.
So we've got research initiated. So again, the TCP is the Technology Control Plan. and you've got either researcher initiated, or maybe there's an export control clause in an award. And this kind of, the process is going to be similar either way. It's just that if we see the clause in the award, I'm going to be coming to you. And if it's research initiated, you're going to be coming to me. But once that happens, then there's a lot of the same information that then we discuss and we look at. So we'll discuss the project and the scope of the work. What is the current data that needs to be protected? What kind of data do you anticipate will need to be protected? And there may be things that are parts of the project that are fundamental research and part that are not. And we had one plan that we had to specify by task. We had to go through in great detail by task, because there could be certain people, certain aspects of it were very controlled and certain aspects were not. So they had to think, and this gets into the personnel needs. It gets into, who are they going to be able to include that work on certain aspects of the project. And so that's something that we have to talk through. You may also need additional personnel depending on what level of security you need. You may have to have some additional security that's going, to be involved with your project and to assist with the security needs of your project. So those things are discussed. And again, the people who are going to have access to the export control technology will need to be on the technology control plan. So we need to be sure everybody's signing off on that, and everybody knows what the plan is and agrees to that plan. We're going to be looking at your IT needs. You're going to be looking at your workspace, again, the inventory, just all of those things will be considered when we're putting this together. We have a template, but then we look at all of these things and we kind of customize that and create the TCP for each project based on the assessment that we do. So next slide. And then again, we touched on some of these things, but the other areas where export control and the export control officer can help, looking at your collaborations. And we've mentioned that the export control officer gets pulled into a lot of these things by process, right? Either the OSP is going to contact the export control officer, or maybe we mentioned down here, the visitors assist with processing and screening. UT has a new visitors policy, and that includes the export control officer signing off on when a visitor comes. So the travel reviews, if there's certain countries that we're going to, then we're going to get pulled into that review and be signing off on that. So there's certain processes that we'll be pulled into, but think about, think about us as a resource, even if it's not required, even if we don't get pulled into the process. If you've got any concerns, or you're thinking, maybe I should talk to the export control officer about any of these issues, then please, reach out and do. Because if you need to be sending something, I think sending a physical item, there may not be anything that captures that in the process, right? But a lot of these other things, we may be pulled into it, but maybe we won't be, right? So just don't assume again that if they're needed, they'll be contacted. Go ahead and get in touch with us, because we can definitely help make sure that you're protecting your research data and make sure that the security is there that needs to be, and help answer some of those questions. I think next slide.
Okay, so I was going to take it back over for shipping, and we've certainly hammered this, but there is a reason for that. Universities often have decentralized shipping, and it is an area of potential risk. It's something that I look at, it's something that audit looks at, and we really want you all to be aware, because sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not okay, and that gray space of knowing whether things are are okay or not, it matters. And again, you have specific laws related to nuclear materials and your field that are a little more probably restrictive than some of the other fields on campus. You cannot export any nuclear equipment as called out in some of these laws. Same for materials. Be very, very careful. Ask before you do. It's very easy to put something in a FedEx box and send it on this campus. Very, very easy. And I can say that Princeton just got in trouble for this as well. They didn't send nuclear materials, but they sent some biohazardous materials internationally, and they're paying some fines for it. So it can happen to anyone. I just want you to be aware that it is completely okay, and I encourage asking questions on this topic, on all the topics that we've covered today. Okay, again, ask, think this through, and it's not that you can't ship things. Sometimes you may just need a license. So go ahead and contact us, because we help you get the license so that you can do the things that you want to do, hopefully, provided the laws and regulations allow for it. Again, this is just hammering it home that shipping and exporting items can have hefty penalties. We're talking about $300,000 for each violation. And I want to drive home that if it's continuing, each day is another $300,000. And they're big penalties, and they're big penalties for a reason. So please do take this seriously. We'll end with saying the Export Control Office and the Export Control Officer is really your best resource for information related to these topics. Please don't make assumptions because of what we've talked about over and over again today, the severity of the penalties and really the minutia of the regulations. You're gonna have things that are export controlled. You're gonna have things that are not export controlled. Again, possibly within the same research project, and it's very normal. This is normal. And the best way to deal with that is to ask questions. And if you end up needing a TCP, just go ahead and get started on one early. As soon as Jane reaches out to you, or if you think you're going to need one for a project, start the conversation. We want this to be a dialogue between our offices and our research community. Again, if you have questions, this is how you contact Jane or me, and we have an export control website that's new and improved. So please feel free to stop by, take a look, and we'll be happy to answer any questions in the exactly 1 minute that we have left, but I imagine Wes would let me stay another few minutes.
Yeah, so we have time for
Questions?
just a couple minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions.
Do we have to be, is there anything restricted about the 1,000 Talents program?
Okay, so Jane, you want me to take this one? The
That's fine,
university
yes.
does not have a policy saying whether or not it endorses participation in a 1,000 Talent program. What I'm about to say is my personal opinion on them, having evaluated several of these 1,000 Talent program agreements. In general, the agreements are such that, and it's written very much like a contract, there are multiple parties involved, everybody signs their work expectations. It can create a conflict of commitment. The area where this has gotten the most attention is conflict of interest as related to both fiscal resources that tend to go with these contracts. Are you reporting the funding that's associated with them or not? And what agencies are involved. So if you want to work with the Department of Energy, it is very, very clear. It's probably the best of the policies. It's the most restrictive, but it's the easiest to interpret. If you want to work with DOE, don't be a member of a foreign talent program. You can pick, and they ask if you're gonna go to ORNL, they ask you to attest to this, that you are not a member of the foreign talent program. So keep it in mind. It's not disallowed, but it can create a conflict. I'm happy to review any sort of collaborative agreement you might be looking at. I think a lot of these contracts come out of a place of wanting to collaborate with people, and suddenly there's this very formal document and set of expectations that go with it. And I'm sure that they can be appealing, but they also have some pitfalls to them. So I would say proceed with caution, ask for advice. As far as research conflict of interest goes, you can come directly to see me about that.
Okay. Any other questions? We didn't leave a lot of time at the end for questions, but this is really important. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them. I kind of have one. So there are a lot of materials that you cannot export. But does that mean that that if you have a funded project where you're using a material, let's say it's some special nuclear material, does that mean that a foreign national can't be funded on that program and actually touch it and use it?
Not necessarily. You might need a license, but not necessarily.
Yeah, might need but
you might need a license, but if the contract says no foreign nationals,
Yeah.
That language about U.S. citizens versus U.S. persons, that matters in that situation.
But I guess my question is, if you have a foreign individual and they handle a piece of nuclear grade graphite, that's not an export. And if they take that with them and leave the country, that's an export. If you tell them something about how to make that, that might be export controlled information. That's a deemed export.
Right.
But sometimes just touching or seeing, an export controlled material isn't off limits. It's really to give them the know-how how to make it. Don't let them take it. Those types of things. So, I mean, that's how I understand it. I just wanted to make, because sometimes you have a student's like, oh my goodness, I just, you have some, and I don't know that, we have a special nuclear material, but let's say you had a lab where some of it is, and they said, oh, I can't believe I saw that, I'm in trouble, it was export control, or I saw this nuclear grade graphite, or I touched it. It's not necessarily, that's not an export, it's not losing any technology. So I just wanted to bring up that, there's a deemed export. If you tell someone some information, they can be in the United States, but if they're a foreign national, that's a deemed export. You've given them that information, and they can leave with that information in their head. So just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the difference of a deemed export and actual export, and then someone may be touching export controlled material, which is not an export.
Yeah, I think as long as, there is that idea of, is it getting into the technology realm, for one thing, as opposed to just physically, literally just touching it. Are we getting into the technology realm is one question. So we have to be careful about that. And then also what level of control that particular item has is also a question, because there's a difference in the definition of use. And it's much more restrictive, for instance, with ITAR and with some of the most restricted EAR than it is with most of what you would run into. So just, again, it depends.
The key there, if you ever wonder, go ask the experts, because it's really difficult to, read any of these things and have a solid understanding without having quite a bit of training. And to people who aren't experts, it seems like there's a lot of gray area. So you need someone to help discretize that gray into white and black for you, because that's what Jane, that's what you're an expert in, and we're really lucky to have you come over now that we've lost Darren. Okay, I'm gonna close out, and again, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jane, for coming over and just telling all the students, if you ever wonder, and if you ever wonder if you should go to them, feel free to come to me, and I'll say, yeah, you should go to them. Talk to your PI first. Again, if you don't think something's happening right, maybe the PI doesn't know, tell someone. Let's all help each other stay out of trouble and do the right thing. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.